Okay, so we're doing Dupre today, and I'll just tell you a little something that happened to me. I had started recording Dupre already earlier this morning. That was somewhere between 8 and 9 o'clock, and the power in Hamilton went down. So I lost that recording, and I think that there were issues with the supply. So I think it was probably related to everyone doing online learning this morning with schools back and so on and so forth. That's just my private guess. Anyway, we're doing Dupre today, and there are two things that I want you to take from this reading in particular. One is his discussion of the idea of modernity and his implicit or explicit establishing of a timeline and working with a timeline. So I want you to notice that. Of course, far more important than that is the notion of the ontotheological synthesis, which is a term that you're probably going to be sick to death of by the end of this course, but is very important to what we want to be doing. So let's make our way through these 5 pages with those two ideas in mind. And we'll start with the notion of modernity in the opening paragraph, in the opening couple of paragraphs. Okay, so very first phrase is the idea of modernity. And what we want to take away from this paragraph is that Dupre is initially breaking up the idea of the modern into a contrast between what is modern and what is pre-modern. So we want to notice that, this fundamental difference between the modern and the pre-modern. The other thing that we might not necessarily be absolutely clear on from this opening paragraph is that Dupre starts with the assumption that our attitude towards the modern right now is critical. He says, while they exalted, he's talking about earlier generations or critics of earlier generations. He says, while they exalted rational objectivity, moral tolerance, and individual choice as cultural absolutes, we now regard these principles with some suspicion. Okay, so if we want an understanding of the modern, we can start with these 3 ideas. An acceptance or a belief in rational objectivity, a belief in, excuse me, that's the garbage truck going down my road just at the moment. Sorry about that. Rational objectivity, moral tolerance, and individual choice. And he says that we now regard these principles with some suspicion. One might say that that's the reason why people started to use the term postmodern, that the idea of the postmodern involved bringing those ideas, rational objectivity, moral tolerance, individual choice, bring those ideas into question and severely criticizing them. So that's an important takeaway from the first paragraph. But the other thing that he launches in this paragraph is the notion that, okay, so who do we blame? Where does the blame lie? And if you see the transition from the first paragraph to the second paragraph, you'll see that the first thing that he looks at is the Enlightenment. Now, sometimes when I think of the Enlightenment, I will quote the Immanuel Kant essay, I think I referred to it last week, written in 1784. And I'll think of the Enlightenment as encompassing the scientific revolution developments in the 16th and 17th centuries. I think that Dupre is using the term Enlightenment here in a narrower sense, simply as applying to the 18th century, and we'll see why in a moment. And what he wants to say is that it's not enough just to say, well, what's the problem with modernity? We'll blame it on the Enlightenment. He thinks that there is more going on earlier, and he's planting a seed here for an idea that we're going to see in a later reading. But in the first instance, he says, look, if we plant the border stones at the onset of the Enlightenment, the critique will continue to have an easy target. It will be too easy, too simplistic to think that the problems with modernity can be blamed on the Enlightenment. And as we turn over the page to page 2 and in the rest of that paragraph, he's going to say there are other candidates for what causes problems. And one of the things he's going to do is he's going to draw attention to the 17th century. And that's where later, when he talks about Galileo and Descartes in a later reading, he's going to push the 17th century as being itself especially problematic. And then he talks about other issues in the transition from the pre-modern to the modern. And as we go into the third paragraph, we see that he starts turning his attention to simply humanism. And he locates this development of humanism in, looking at the start of paragraph 3, the late 14th century. He'll go on to say the late 14th century and mostly completed before the end of the 15th. And he calls this an early humanism. Now, is this humanism responsible for a shift towards the modern that has now become problematic? Okay, 2 points here. One is that there's, for him, continuity between this humanism and that which came before. So he doesn't see a really strong contrast between the pre-modern and humanism. He says this, that humanism, though thoroughly innovative, suggests newness, preserved, as Paul Christeller has shown, a strong link with medieval Italian culture. So for him, the idea of humanism can preserve continuity between something older that was present in medieval Italian culture and something that is indeed innovative. Furthermore, he says that this early Italian humanism developed naturally out of a native rhetorical tradition of the Italian Middle Ages. So it's a natural development, and the emphasis again is on continuity, on possibility. So innovation is possible within a historical understanding that emphasizes continuity. So in paragraphs 2 and 3, he is trying to get to the idea of how is it that the modern differs from the pre-modern? Who are our candidates? Who are we going to blame? And he's saying we can't be satisfied with simplistic explanations. All right. That takes us to page 3 and paragraph 4 at the top of page 3, where he really lays out what happens, in his opinion, in going from the pre-modern to the modern. And we're going to run into a term that we met last week with the Boersma reading. Only when the early humanist notion of human creativity came to form a combustive mixture with the negative conclusions of nominalist theology did it cause the cultural explosion that we refer to as modernity. Terribly important sentence. So, humanism emphasizes human creativity. Okay. So that in itself is not the problem. And the reason why this is going to be important for later ideas is that we can sometimes think, oh, well, creativity and innovation, that's what makes you modern, and that's what makes you different from the pre-modern. And he's going to say, no, that's not the issue. It's only when that idea of creativity combines with the negative conclusions of nominalist theology. And if you remember back to last week's reading from Boersma said, if we think about the relationship between the sign and the thing that it refers to in terms of a disconnect, if we think that there's only a nominal relationship between the word and the thing, or the sign and the thing, then we have an ontology that is different from a participatory ontology, an ontology of coherence, an ontology that he wants to describe in terms of sacramentalism rather than symbolism. So that nominalist theology or philosophy develops at the close of the Middle Ages. It combines with the notion of creativity to cause the cultural explosion that we refer to as modernity. Okay, so he's answered at the beginning of paragraph 4 his initial question about where do we really need to lay the blame for thinking about this transition from the pre-modern to the modern. Now, the rest of paragraph 4 is also terribly, terribly important for then laying out what he means by the pre-modern and how he wants to describe it. And the way that he wants to describe it is with the term that he introduces only in paragraph 5. I want to drop down to paragraph 5 for just a moment to find that phrase, and then we're going to go back up to paragraph 4. Okay, so we're still on page 3, the bottom of the page, and he says, he's got this long sentence, in this book I intend to investigate, blah, 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 blah. And then that goes on for 4 lines. And then he says, the two combined caused the ontotheological synthesis that had guided Western thought to break down. So that's the first time that we find the phrase, the ontotheological synthesis. And it drops it in there. It's an interesting rhetorical technique that he drops it in after he has already described it. Okay, so what is it that he's describing? See, I wanted to lecture at 8 o'clock in the morning before the garbage truck came, and before whoever it is that is now, mowing or sawing or whatever in the background is doing that. Anyway, I hope that the sound is not too disruptive for you. I'm going to carry on. So, nominalism causes a cultural explosion. What was before that? Its impact, I'm back up to the top of page 3. Its impact shattered the organic unity of the Western view of the real. So let's simply take that phrase, organic unity, take it to the bank. Now, this idea of organic unity manifests itself in different cultures in different ways. So he's going to use three different words here, and they all describe the same thing, but in slightly different cultural contexts. So first off, he starts with the Ionian concept of physis. And notice how he describes it. It combines 3 things: a physical component, which is like the natural world and the way that we think of as the natural world, a physical component, an anthropic component, refers to humanity, human beings, and a divine component. All 3 of these things are united. Then he introduces 2 other contexts and 2 other words. The Greek notion of the cosmos, used by Plato and Aristotle, and the Roman concept of natura. Physis, cosmos, and natura are all terms that combine or have implied in them a combination of a physical, an anthropic, and a divine component. You're referring, when you refer to natura, to all 3 simultaneously. We don't think that way. We don't think that way. We distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. We distinguish between the natural even and the human. Okay, that's the most important concept. And we can think of it in the first instance with reference to the Ionian, the Greek, and the Roman cultures. But it's going to be important for us later on, especially because we're going to be using this when we get to Augustine, that we include two other cultures as well. And here this is a little tricky, and I cannot stress this enough. I need you to pay attention here and to get this right, otherwise you're going to trip over it later. It's organic unity, this organic unity of, call it physis, cosmos, nature, whatever, the ontotheological synthesis. Its organic unity had been threatened by the Hebrew Christian conception of a creator who remained outside the cosmos. Okay. It was threatened. There seemed to be something different. And indeed, there was something a little bit different going on in this Hebrew Christian conception. But the emphasis for Dupre is more on the continuity than any discontinuity. Notice the word yet. Yet, through his wisdom, support, and grace, he, that is this conception of the Creator, continued to be present in this world. So, the Hebrew Christian conception that Augustine is going to be working with is going to put a little pressure on physis, cosmos, and natura, but the emphasis is more on similarity than dissimilarity. The emphasis is more on the fact that the divine principle is still with nature and humanity rather than separate from them. There's separation, but somehow the continuity is preserved. Okay? Terribly, terribly important. For all four of those then, Ionian, Greek, Roman, and Christian Hebrew, 5 if you want to think that way. For all of them, they all subscribe to this idea of the ontotheological synthesis. They all share this understanding in the pre-modern concept. So we're connected. We're connected to the realm of the spirit. We're connected, deeply connected to the natural world. There's a sense of microcosm and macrocosm, a sense of mirroring, a deep sense of synthesis, combining those three realms. And that's what he says that he's going to do, to return now to the bottom of page 3 and paragraph 5. He says that he's going to follow the movement from the continuity to what he calls the double breakup. All right. Well, I'm just going to pause there. I'm not going to turn off my recording, but I'm just going to pause and collect my thoughts for just a moment. Again, I'm sorry for the humming sound in the background. Okay. The next thing that I want to do with this reading, and I've got 2 more points that I want to make. One that I've already kind of made in a little bit, so I'll just want to return to it. But the other point that I want to make is, so if we're thinking in terms of this timeline, let's return back to the modern part. So we go from classical period through the Ionian, the Greek, and the Roman, and the Hebrew Christian, all the way up to nominalism and this transition to the modern. But we are in that situation. So Who is it that criticizes modernity? As we think about the timeline in the modern period, who is it that criticizes? And what he does on pages, starting at the bottom of page 3 and over on pages 4 and 5, is he gives you a list. Now, if we were in class, I would pause at this point and I would ask you to name the people that he names as critics of modernity. Can't do that. Silence is going to simply be filled up by that saw in my background. So, thank you. I'll take that as take you as a response that allows me to come in now and work with his thoughts. So he talks about several critics of modernity, and the first of them is Hegel. And he mentions Hegel's name and describing the cultural alienation as inherent in culture itself. And then over the page, he refers to Karl Marx, and Karl Marx as a critic of modernity. Thirdly, he mentions Freud taking our civilization to task for its repressive character. And then Nietzsche. He talks about Nietzsche as a critic of modernity. I just want to pause over this Nietzsche one and just read him a little bit. Nietzsche went further in his critique, that is, his critique of modernity. He questioned, it's true, he questioned the ontotheological conception that has dominated Western thought from the beginning. Since Socrates, our culture has given an absolute priority to the logos, and it has justified its one-sided intellectualist orientation by founding it on the idea of a spiritual God. And he does see, Nietzsche sees a kind of pressure in that. It's the pressure of nihilism. Nihilism in this context means paying insufficient attention to the continuity, the presence of the presence of the divine, the anthropic, and the natural all together. The nihilism inherent in this idea has increasingly undermined the ontotheological foundation of Western thought. In Nietzsche's critique, the modern epoch merely intensified and completed a process that had begun in the 5th century BC. So Nietzsche wants to say that, in fact, the breakup of the synthesis is present all along. Nonetheless, it's the breakup that concerns Nietzsche as a descriptor of modernity. Okay. So what those paragraphs, what page 4 gives us, is a sense of where we are now. We are more immediately the inheritors of the philosophy of Hegel, the economic and social ideas of Marx, the psychological ideas of Freud, and the deep philosophical critique of Nietzsche. Right? Those people really inform contemporary thought and help to shape what it is that bugs us about modernity and helps us to realize that being modern is not a bed of roses, is itself deeply problematic. And what Dupre is doing is he's going back to the pre-modern, and he wants us to understand that in a particular way as perhaps having something to offer that got lost in the modern. For my final point, I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of page 5. We cut this paragraph off in midstream. I only photocopied or scanned to the bottom of page 5. But I want to return to this idea of creativity. Again, we might think creativity, it means contemporary, you're hip, you're up to date, you're willing to change. You might think, well, that's the opposite of being stuck in the past, being medieval, being bound to tradition. And that's not the issue for Dupre. So what we want to do is we want to talk about creativity, including rhetorical creativity, the freedom to speak in unique ways, as belonging to the pre-modern way of being. Okay. The extraordinary creativity that introduced modern culture, even while the old synthesis was breaking up, held in fact the promise of a new cultural integration. In other words, an integration that was in sync with what had gone before. The latter was a far more radical revolution, partly induced by the disintegrating effect of older, late medieval factors. So, just to end this reading of Dupre, I want you to notice that creativity itself is not the problem, but it's the way that it combines with other factors that he calls nominalism and describes in a few different ways. All right, we're going to leave the Dupre reading there.